Welcome to the Coffee, Kegs and Kriegsspiel Podcast. I am your guest host, Paul LaFontaine, known in the IKS community as Umpire LaFondios. Our guest today is Sean Barnett. Sean is an adjunct engineer at RAND, where he is a defense analyst, nuclear engineer, and attorney with over 30 years of experience leading research in the fields of national security, energy, and law. At RAND, most of his work has involved military operational assessments and wargaming. He enjoys traveling military history and wargaming, and he's written short books on wargaming scenarios centered on the World War II battles of Villers Bocage and Operation Epsom. Sean was a guest commentator on our recent Grand Gettysburg live game. In this podcast, we'll talk about that scenario and compare it to Sean's work on alternative history Gettysburg scenarios that he has conducted, both for himself and for the U.S. Army. Now to the podcast. Sean Barnett, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Paul. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, first, I want to lead off by thanking you on behalf of the International Kriegsspiel Society, first of all, for coming here and doing this. But most importantly, you spent a lot of time with us commentating on the actual Grand Gettysburg event. And that was 2 days and about 17 hours of time. So that was a time that we really appreciate you spending with us. And thanks from the heart, from the whole community for your participation.
Well, thank you. It was very interesting, and I enjoyed being there with you and Jan when we were watching the game and talking to the players. So it was a fun experience.
Just give a little bit of your background and what you're doing now, because you have a great history in wargaming and simulations and the hobby in general. So just give us a little bit about you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm currently, for a little while, a defense analyst at the RAND Corporation, and I've been a defense analyst through most of my career. Most of my time at RAND and at the Institute for Defense Analyses. At RAND, my work is mostly involves wargaming and military operational assessments, mostly for the Army and the Joint Staff. So that's my professional background. Hobby-wise, I've been involved in war games for almost 50 years now, as hard as that is to believe. My first one was Tactics 2. I went to the hobby store when I was a kid, and I saw it there, and it looked interesting, so I bought it, and the rest is history. So I've been done all kinds of gaming for many years, and great to get involved in Kriegspieling with the Kriegsspiel Society, and I also ran before getting involved with the Kriegsspiel Society a large multi-blind Gettysburg campaign game as a Kriegspiel during the pandemic. During those years, and this was 2020, that year, we were all staying at home, mostly trying to stay out of contact with each other. So we were sort of looking for things to do while we were doing that, and came up with the idea of running a large multi-blind Gettysburg campaign game, which I did with 29 players, with players representing infantry corps commanders and cavalry brigade commanders. And we started at Fredericksburg in early June with the two armies facing off. And then they took off with the Confederates trying to invade Maryland and Pennsylvania, and the Union trying to stop them. And we played that for about 5 months and played it to conclusion. And that was a lot of fun. It's very interesting with the players trying to deal with limited information and the information gathering instruments they had, like cavalry and observation stations and spies and scouts and those kinds of things. And it was a lot of fun. It was a great game. And I just recently wrote that up in an article in the Military Operations Research Society War Game Journal. So I think that's accessible.
It was a great paper. I had a chance that you shared it with me, and I really enjoyed reading it. We're definitely gonna dive into that game you ran, because we want to compare and contrast what we did here. It's my strategy to never actually admit how long I've been playing war games. Although if an Avalon Hill version of France 1940 was my first game, that you might be able to time and date that if you went back and did the research.
Yeah, that's an old classic too.
Anyway,
you're bringing,
I'm proud of it.
The wealth of your experience.
Right, that's the way I like to look at it. So, RAND Corporation, you're a senior analyst. You've done this. What? And I asked this not to divert from Gettysburg, but a lot of our younger members are interested in a career in wargaming potentially. What brought you down that path? Just a few minutes on how you got there.
Sure thing. Well, I've been a wargamer since I was a kid, and have been interested in war games forever. And about 9 years ago now, I guess, I had been at the Institute for Defense Analyses, working as a defense analyst on many subject areas that the department was interested in. But about 9 years ago, I was talking to a friend I met through Wargaming who was at RAND, who said, we do war games at RAND for the Defense Department, and if you're interested, you should think about coming over to help us do that. And so I thought about it and said, yeah, I think that would be fun. So I applied and went over to do that. And what I found is that with respect to game design, the objectives are different because you're working for a military audience and they have specific goals of their wargaming, but the techniques in a sense are really similar to the techniques used to design hobby war games in terms of coming up with the combat power of the units and the rules for interactions. And if you're interested in a limited information or multi-blind game, how do you limit the information available to the players? Those things are very similar, and so I was able to fit right in with the folks who do that, working on generally speaking, current events or near future events, if you will, like a potential conflict with Russia, potential conflict with China, North Korea, those kinds of things. But we also got to do a game on Gettysburg for the Army. They were interested in using a Gettysburg game as a teaching device for Army officers and Army staff, and as a way to, the use of history is a way to draw them away from their current concerns over what they might be working on, some program they might be interested in and concerned about immediately. Putting them in a historical setting allows them to just think about the assets that they have at hand and how they might use them to fight a conflict. And so the Army does that, uses history from time to time, set as a teaching vehicle to try to get that separation from day-to-day events, so to speak.
That's so interesting because I imagine it removes them from their assumptions, and they know so much about their current equipment. For example, they have to go back to zero almost around things like equipment ranges, march rates, things like that.
Right, and those kinds of things. And we designed a Gettysburg game for them that did that. It was sort of a grand tactical Gettysburg game. Well, two games actually, looking at the first and second day of Gettysburg. But yeah, we provided all that information to the players and told them, okay, you've got these assets, you've got these capabilities. Now go fight the battle and win, and allowed them to, try what they wanted to try. And that was the goal of the exercise, to get them, thinking about how to use new capabilities that they might have, because, the Army will develop new capabilities, looking into the future, and they want to get their officers and staff, give them some experience with, testing out new things, so to speak.
Well, talk about the technology changes that you made in the specific Gettysburg that you ran. I thought that was very interesting because you actually introduced alternative technology. So talk a little bit about that.
Sure. This was the game. The objective of the game was to refight the Battle of Gettysburg in a sense, but give the players alternative military technologies that were available in 1863 but not used during the battle as new capabilities that they could use to try to win as best they were able. And the technologies we looked at specifically one was the observation balloon, which the Union Army had earlier in the war, but they just didn't have them at Gettysburg. We looked at the battlefield telegraph. Union Army also had that a little bit earlier in the war at Chancellorsville, and then later in the war, but they didn't have them at Gettysburg. And then finally, repeating rifles and Gatling guns. There were a few repeating rifles at Gettysburg, but not a large number, and the Gatling gun wasn't available until later in the war. And so that's obviously added firepower that the commanders could use to their advantage. And so we gave the players, we gave the technology to both sides because we wanted to see how, an opposed fight with the technologies might turn out. And we said, all right, you've got 2 observation balloons, you've got so many Gatling guns, you've got a division with repeating rifles, you've got so many miles of battlefield telegraph that you can lay out. The players can do what you wish with those assets, and then we'll run the game and we'll see how it turns out, and you can get a sense of what worked and what didn't. in experimenting with those technologies. And so that was a successful exercise. It was very interesting. The players were pretty creative in what they did with their assets, and that's what we wanted, was for people to think about, okay, I've got these new capabilities. How can I use them in creative ways to be effective?
Well, talking a bit about the alternatives that we used in the Grand Gettysburg and the interesting north-south orientation that resulted from the way the scenario played out, were there any major differences in the ability to, say, observation balloons that actually changed the maneuvering such that it actually altered the way that the battlefield was set up or the different armies deployed?
In our game, it did. It definitely made a difference, because in our game, the balloons, we gave them an observation range of about 10 miles. So they put up a balloon, they were getting information on what was 10 miles from that point. Historically, the commanders would have to use cavalry in a reconnaissance role, fanning out over an area to try to gain that information. But the balloon gave them more capability to do that. And both sides used them to try to learn where the enemy was and then maneuver against them in ways they might not have been able to historically. And they got quite creative. I think in one of the games, the Confederates, because our map area was pretty big, it encompassed area west of South Mountain and east all the way to Hanover. In one of the games, the Confederates decided to move west of South Mountain and south to come over another mountain pass, sort of to the southwest of Gettysburg, to try to surprise the Union Army that way. And out of a line of sight of the balloons, because the balloons couldn't see over the mountain. And so
using the mountains essentially to screen the movement, right?
Right. Yeah. So that was interesting. And they got pretty creative about that. There was one game in which I think it was the Confederates were trying to use their cavalry to capture one of the Union balloons to take that out of the equation. And so, yeah, they really got to be pretty creative.
I think an intriguing thing that you did that the International Kriegsspiel Society umpires can probably take a page from is the fact that you used actual technology that was available at the time, just not at the battle. So rather than bringing some sort of steampunk crazy technology in, it's like no, these things actually existed back then.
Yeah, and we thought about that. Initially when we were thinking about this exercise, we thought about some sort of steampunk-esque things, machine guns, radios, airplanes, that kind of stuff. But then we thought that it's a lot of fun, if you're into sort of what is it, Harry Turtledove, I guess, Guns of the South,
right.
The Gettysburg. If you're into that, it's fun. But we thought that for an Army audience, that they would want something that was more grounded in history. And so the fact that we could say, hey, these things really existed, they could have been used, but for various reasons were not, would give the game more credibility and utility with an Army audience.
That's fascinating. That's great. You'll definitely now find 4 or 5 different IKS scenarios with this approach, likely, because this group is very fast to adapt new ideas.
Well, that's great.
So let's talk about the IKS Grand Gettysburg. We had 47 players, 20 umpires or umpire assistants helped support the effort. So it was that's why we call it grand. It just means that all hands on deck. What was your overall impression of our approach, the reporting, and just give your high level opinion of how we approach it based on your experience?
Sure. I thought it was very impressive. I mean, that many people involved in a game, and it was essentially 2 full days of gaming, coming in, playing the first day and then the second day. And the fact that you had the players separated so you could implement the multi-blind nature of the battle, and then all the umpires working simultaneously to resolve combat. With the games that we did at RAND, we ran our game double blind, not multi-blind. So it was a Union view and then a Confederate view. We had a team of 2 umpires resolving combat and resolving lines of sight. And that takes a certain amount of time to do that. And then in my Gettysburg campaign game, I was the only one. I was doing everything. So that took days to resolve each move. Each move was a day. So I thought the way you guys did, that you were able to move almost in real time with your multiple umpires was very interesting. And I think, that's a real credit to you guys. You were able to execute a game like that.
The pre-game maneuver, which is similar to your more operation or grand tactical movements that you talked about, Did you observe, what were your thoughts about how we conducted that pregame maneuver and just the fact that a lot of units came to the field on the first day is one of the observations I had. What were your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I gathered that the premise of your scenario was that the Confederate cavalry got to Gettysburg first. I'm right about that. I'm remembering right about that. So that meant that the Union had to react to the fact that they had a heavier Confederate presence at Gettysburg, north of the Army of the Potomac at the time when the battle started. And they could assume that there would be other Confederate units coming to that point, but they'd have to deal with the fact that the Confederates essentially held the field at the very beginning of the battle. That's obviously very different from the historical battle where the Union cavalry gets there first, and then the Confederates are dealing with that presence, and the Union is coming up to try to support them, and the Confederates are coming in to try to knock them out. And then that produces a totally different perspective on the battle, sort of a reversal of fortune, if you will.
Right. Stuart was present at Gettysburg was one of the big shifts, like your use of observation balloons. In this case, we had Stuart was hardwired in the scenario to be at Gettysburg, so we knew that was one of the shifts.
It proves an interesting and different scenario from the historical game.
And interestingly, as the first day went on, the placement of the units relative to the high ground was reversed from the historical. So in fact, the Confederates ended up on the high ground. Did you find in your grand tactical approach that Gettysburg was automatic? Or I think one of the things in just going back through the logs of our game and creating the AAR for it was like Gettysburg was a preordained conclusion that we were going to fight there. So therefore all the units just on the grand tactical scale kind of congealed at that spot. You mentioned the fact that the Confederates tried to use those mountains. Was Gettysburg automatic in your grand tactical game, or it just emerged that way?
No, it wasn't. In fact, we ran the game multiple times, and there were instances, if I remember right, where there was no fighting at Gettysburg itself, where it took place at different places in the area where the two sides saw each other and decided to fight in those places. But yeah, it wasn't. We did not attach any significance to Gettysburg itself. We said obviously it's there. We gave them historical maps. We gave them historical starting locations at dawn on day one, but at dawn on day one, there's no infantry in Gettysburg, right? It's only Union cavalry.
Right.
So they were free. The players were free to decide: do you want to fight at Gettysburg? Do you want to fight somewhere else? And at least one game, there was no fighting at all at Gettysburg.
And that's there are books out there with hypothesis that it was the road network that caused Gettysburg, et cetera. But if you look at your experience at the game and just general grand tactical operational level games, Gettysburg is not necessarily a foregone conclusion. It's more just how it turned out, right?
Yeah, and I think if you look at the road network in the area, it's dense enough that the armies were able to move around Gettysburg. I mean, Gettysburg is a road junction of several roads coming together, but if you don't want to go to Gettysburg and you want to try to maneuver around there, the road network is dense enough that it's possible to do that. So, and in our games, there were certainly times when there was no fighting in Gettysburg when the commanders did that.
You make a really interesting point about Stuart being there early, and I think that it ended up with the Confederates somewhat spread out. If you recall, the Stuart was far in the south, almost even with Little Round Top screening the Confederate force. A.P. Hill was coming down through Gettysburg, and then Ewell was still the far north of the map. That's quite spread out on the first day. And do you think that was automatic as a result of the cavalry coming in, or is that something that the Confederate commands could have maybe wrangled a little bit?
Yeah, I think that has to do with where the Confederate infantry starts. Depending on how far back you start your exercise, at dawn on day one, the Confederate infantry is still spread out. There are some forces that are west of South Mountain, some just coming over through Cashtown. You had Ewell's Corps, some coming down from Carlisle, and then Early coming over from the northeast. And so they are spread out. and then the Army of the Potomac is spread out to a degree, utilizing the road network to try to sort of move north in parallel. But I think the Confederates being spread out, if you start out sort of early on day one or maybe the day before, that's sort of the nature of the fact that you had Richard Ewell in Pennsylvania for a week before the rest of Lee's army shows up. And so it's just a natural separation there, that unless they make an effort to get together early, I think that's just a natural outcome of the historical dispositions.
Now, at 11 o'clock on the first day, Longstreet with the 1st Confederate Corps appears on the battlefield. And I think Hill and Ewell were they just had to follow what was happening. They followed Stewart on the battlefield, and they had to find the ground. Longstreet is one that has a choice because he has the Willoughby Run in the west, and he decides to split his corps across it. And what were your thoughts on Longstreet's options at 11 o'clock? I thought he was probably the one Confederate that had some choice in the matter.
Yeah, it was interesting as we were looking at that and commenting on that. I remember we were asking ourselves, is he going to go east or west of Willoughby Run, or will he split his force? At the time, there were Union forces that were sort of moving north on the west side of Willoughby Run. I think it was Howard who was there, and we saw that as a possible threat to the Confederate line of communication. So there was some reason for Longstreet to want to try to drive him back south. It would also potentially give Longstreet leverage on the Union if they were able to drive south and then attack from the west. But on the other hand, if the Confederates need support closer to Gettysburg, as it turned out they did, then having a division or two on that side of Willoughby Run closer to Gettysburg could be advantageous. I think that if I recall in the game, Hood's division came over to the east of Willoughby Run and then made an attack against, I think it was Howard, either Howard's or Sickles' forces that were there, that didn't turn out so well. It was a one division attack that unfortunately for him didn't work out so well. And so that sort of mitigated, I think, the power of Longstreet coming in, losing that capability. But he ultimately did have some success driving south on the west side of Willoughby Run, although it took some time. And that it's always a question. I can hit them over here, I can hit the Union over here, but even if I'm successful, will I have time for that fully develop and come in to influence the rest of the fight? And so that's an interesting question. That there's a trade-off.
The beauty of the format to me in terms of the double blind is that if you recall around that period, the character of Meade was really not sure didn't have a lot of information and was trying to figure out what was going on. Howard had started on the east side of Willoughby Run, which would have called for Longstreet to concentrate near Gettysburg. And then he moved to the west side, which really created a dilemma for Longstreet and for Lee. And I think that these moves, I'm not sure Howard was specifically told to do that to try to split the Confederate effort, but he really positioned himself very well. And he's kind of an unsung hero here because as a result of Howard being on the west side of Willoughby Run, but stopping there, it forced Longstreet to make some bad decisions with really a bad situation, and it split up his power a bit on the west side. And in the end, that became decisive on day two. So the player who played Howard actually really, even though he just moved over there and did one thing, played a really key role, in my opinion, in the whole shape of the battle.
Yeah, that was interesting because we were talking about the fact that the Confederate line of communication, their army trains are back down the Cashtown Road, and if Howard is sitting there just south of that road, and the Confederates don't cover it, then he potentially moves to cut that line of communication, which would be problematic for the Confederates. So there's an incentive for the Confederates to get him out of there. On the other hand, that's not where the main fight is taking place. If you could send all of Longstreet's corps into the center to fight there, then that would have helped the Confederates in the center and improve their position, just southwest of Gettysburg. So Yeah, it's interesting to create that dilemma.
You've run multiple versions of Gettysburg. You've had a chance to watch this one. Obviously, you know the history. I guess my question is there any configuration of forces for the Confederates that would be superior to what ended up happening historically? Is there a way the Confederates could actually parlay a positional advantage? Because in our scenario, they actually had the high ground. So the high ground that everyone was trying to take, they had it, but it still left that western side up McPherson and Seminary Ridges weakened. And therefore, in day two, it ended up with the Union pushing up there. Is there a way the Confederates can go on this specific field and have an advantage?
It's an interesting question. I mean, historically, it's debated after the Confederates won the first day at Gettysburg, right? They defeated 11th Corps and they damaged 1st Corps, knocked them back through Gettysburg, back up onto Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. And it's debated, could the Confederates have continued their attack and, for example, Ewell push up onto Culp's Hill to unhinge that Union position that became strong on day 2 and day 3? And it, maybe, right? I mean, there's the famous scene in the movie where Richard Ewell is criticized for not doing that. But Ewell's troops had fought hard and they were, somewhat dispersed by the effects of the fighting. And so that's an open question. They might have been able to push up onto Culp's Hill, but then does the Union, with their forces coming up, with the Union 12th Corps historically coming up late in the day, could they have knocked them back off? And so it's not entirely clear, given what happened, whether the Confederates could have done a lot better. I mean, there were sort of tactical, successes and failures on both sides, but it's not clear, to me, whether the Confederates could do a lot better on the first day. And then, given the results of the first day, if they're faced with a situation on the second day, what could they do? They did, all things considered, pretty well on the second day, aided by Dan Sickles' move to the Peach Orchard that left that force thinned out. And then they, I think casualty-wise on the second day, they actually inflicted more casualties on the Union than they suffered, but they were not quite able to take the position of Cemetery Ridge. If Hill's Corps had continued to support Lee's attack as they were supposed to, they might have been able to do that. And the question is, can they get enough force up onto Cemetery Ridge to cause the Union to give up on the position? Or would the Union just sort of, hang on and commit their reinforcements as they were coming in? Ultimately, maybe the what's left of 5th Corps or 6th Corps coming in late in the day to cause the Confederates to fall back from Cemetery Ridge if they were able to take it. And so that's also an interesting possibility. The Union does have the advantage of numbers at Gettysburg, and so they sort of have that going for them. Then that's hard for the Confederates to overcome. I think that it's more likely than not that the Union will win historical Gettysburg if you play it out several times.
Right. Well, in our case, in our scenario, we tested the hypothesis: what if the Confederates had been able to push through Gettysburg and take the high ground? The Confederates, Hill and Ewell's Corps, both had all the way from Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, Wolf's Hill, all that was in Confederate hands. But still, that line of communication heading northwest created the weakness. And so the fact that they came in from the northwest and took the high ground, they still had to defend up the long way up McPherson and Seminary Ridges. And that caused the problem because the Union did a nearly perfect maneuver and said, okay, we'll go up the ridges and cut your line of communication, which will force you out of the position.
Yeah, and I remember the discussion sort of after the battle was over, but among the Confederates about how they were going to extract their army from the position they were in. And they were thinking about moving to the east, back down the Hanover Road, the York Road, ultimately toward Baltimore, and then back out into Northern Virginia. And that's difficult. They're moving closer to Union forces in Baltimore and Washington rather than farther away. And so that would have been a challenge to do that. Would have been interesting to play. Right. I think it would have been a challenge.
Absolutely. Now, command and control. Just your thoughts. Our player who played Lee, Kevin Sue I think he did a tremendous job. He was very coherent. He moved through the field, and I would give him high marks for his exertion of command and control in the scenario in a Kriegsspiel. Every time we dropped in on him, he seemed to be working with his commanders, and I can't compliment him enough. On the Union side, just basically based on the mechanics of people and everything, we actually had 3 different meads.
Yeah.
One on first day, half day, then a second one on the second half day, and then the second one couldn't make it for the next session, so a third one. So we had 3 meads, and yet the Union pulls off nearly a perfectly orchestrated attack up the ridges to actually achieve victory. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I thought they did a good job, and you know, we were listening to them and interviewing them during the game, and they were confronted with difficult jobs, Lee and Meade, because their communication was limited, their information was limited, but they were still able to mostly get their armies to function well, which is I think that is a testament to them. They were both very dynamic and running around the battlefield to try to get their armies to respond to the situations that they faced. And so yeah, I thought that was a credit to them. They might have been able to use a battlefield telegraph if they had it available to them,
right,
to talk to some of the commanders that were farther away from their immediate locations.
Well, talk about the battlefield telegraph. I think we all understand the telegraph coming from D.C. to major points on the maneuver, and that Lincoln was in charge with Grant, for example. What was a battlefield telegraph, and how was it different for those of us who might want to try it at an ACW scenario?
Yeah, the battlefield telegraph was operated by a hand crank generator, and it had a maximum range of about 8 miles. You could lay out the wire and communicate slowly. The bandwidth was low for the particular telegraph device that they were using, but you could communicate over a distance of about 8 miles, and it allowed the commanders to send simple messages back and forth. There were challenges with using it. I mean, it's early electrical technology, if you will. So you can imagine electrical devices on the battlefield, that there are all sorts of ways that they can be interfered with. If a horse steps on the wire and cuts it, you lose that.
Because the wire was on the ground, I'm assuming, so they would run it along the ground.
That's right. It was laid along the ground, and so if water got into the system somehow, wet ground, that would be problematic. And so the Union had them at Chancellorsville, and I'm not familiar with all the details of how they worked, but I think they worked to a degree, but they had problems with them. So it was helpful, but so yeah, you could, in our game when we ran it, we allowed the players to lay out the telegraph line and then use it to communicate. And what we did was we allowed messages to be delivered instantaneously at the end of the line, and we also, to deal with sort of tactical command and control, we gave the players a bonus to accepting orders. In our game, there was an issue of a receiving commander accepting orders. It wasn't assumed to be perfect that they would automatically receive and understand an order. So we resolved that with a die roll, and we gave a player a bonus if the telegraph was there, because it would have allowed the receiving commander to ask questions of the commander issuing the order had it been in place, and so that would clarify. Which would
obviously increase the level of clarity. That's really interesting, and I've never seen one used in an IKS game. So again, it would probably be another one that will be tested real soon. It's an intriguing idea.
Yeah.
Particularly as a commander, if you think through how you use it, rather than just having it be a general wire network for everyone, if you specifically target a reserve, for example, to come up quickly or whatever, that type of thing would help.
And really in our game, we gave the players one system per corps. So there was one connection from the Army commander to each corps in the Army, with the exception of the Confederates. For Ewell, since he started so far away, he was out of range. Wasn't possible for Lee to reach him on the first day, so there was no connection there. That would have to be established during the game if the Confederates wanted to do it.
Another strength of the Kriegsspiel approach is that communication is so critical to it. Playing with some of these communications technologies really does make a large difference.
Yeah, Yeah, I can see that.
Super. So the Confederates lost in the scenario 25% of their strength, which is a tremendous loss. So we were talking about the tremendous losses that were being suffered in the scenario, but really, historically, the Confederates lost nearly 35% of their force. What do you make of the loss rates, and are all Civil War battles, is it inevitable that we're going to have that kind of loss rates when you throw 80,000 to 60,000 on the side and jam them together?
Yeah, I think they tend to be that way. They tend to be, most Civil War battles tended to be relatively even in terms of loss rates. There were some exceptions. Fredericksburg is an obvious exception, where the Union is trying to attack across the river into a fortified position. That went poorly. That the casualties were rather one-sided against the Union. At Winchester during the Gettysburg campaign, when Ewell was attacking Milroy's forces in Winchester, they were able to envelop them and take that position at quite low losses, and they essentially routed that force. So that was a rather decisive victory for the Confederates there as well. But in general, Civil War casualty levels tended to be relatively close. And I think it's just the nature of the Army. You have infantry armies, infantry and artillery armies coming together, and they tend to come together relatively slowly. And it's just, there's an attrition process. They're deployed in the field. There's an attrition process, and then the attacker eventually reaches a point of culmination because of casualties and disorganization, and the defender is falling back to try to get out of the attacker's reach. And I think it tends to produce those kinds of outcomes. So yeah, in the game, I thought that was a very plausible outcome given the way the sides were fighting. It was sort of a head-to-head fight. There were no great surprises on either side. No one really got trapped in a position where they could be attrited without great loss to the other side. And so I thought those results were pretty plausible.
Yeah. And the battle went 2 days versus the historical 3. I think there was there was just much more fighting on the first day in the scenario, based on the fact there were more units on the field. How did that feel to you in terms of the 2-day versus 3-day battle?
Yeah, I thought that outcome was, not having a third day was reasonable. That both sides were to an extent exhausted by the fighting, and you didn't have a fresh, Pickett's division to throw in a last attack in Pickett's charge historically, and I know both sides were complaining about Lee and Meade saying, I have no more reserves. This is it. This is all we've got. And so I think that for there not to have been a third day of fighting seemed reasonable to me.
Now that you've had a chance to see how we do it, certainly comparing and contrasting to some excellent work you've done on Gettysburg, both professionally as well as a hobbyist, what kind of takeaways would you take from this, or what was something that was interesting and new that you saw here?
Well, as I say, what I thought was really impressive was the way you could bring all the players together and the umpires together and run the game almost in real time. That I thought was really impressive. And we'd have to, among all my hobby gamer friends, we'd have to work hard to bring a crew together to do something like that. And so that was really neat. I mean, to have that capability, and I know you guys run a lot of games. I mean, all the time. And so to have that, I thought was really impressive, and gives you a lot of options in terms of running all sorts of games, and to do them in a reasonable amount of calendar time, so to speak, not like my Gettysburg campaign that took place over 5 months. You can do it in a much more amenable period of time. You did the battle again.
And in the spirit of honesty, we can only really pull off 2 of these a year, and everyone is exhausted and sleeping for weeks afterwards. It is you want to talk about a culmination point. That last day of a grand, there is a culmination point. I think two really key insights that you brought to the experience is your discussion about the use of technology of the period was, I think, really interesting and unique, and I'm certain that some of us will adopt some of those ideas. And then just this idea that there's an inevitability to the way these historical things will play out. And I thought it was very viable in the commenting channel as we were commentating on it for 17 hours, just always being able to compare that second look at Gettysburg from your own experience. I thought that was very unique and valuable. And so I think the collaboration was great. And we certainly hope to have you back more certainly have you in and do some more commentating, because you really provided a lot of value. We want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Sean Barnett, thanks so much for being on the podcast. You're a tremendous guest and a friend of the community, and we really look forward to having you back.
All right. I'll look forward to it as well. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Coffee, Kegs and Kriegsspiel Podcast, where we talk about all things Kriegsspiel. Come join us for live and play-by-post scenarios in our Discord server, and check out our website through the link in the show notes. We'll see you out there.